They were four teenage girls, best friends, sisters, closing up a little yogurt shop on a chilly Friday night in Austin, Texas. By sunrise, they'd become the center of one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in American history. A fire, a scene so gruesome investigators would never forget it, and a mystery that, more than 30 years later, refuses to let go. What happened in those final minutes before the flames consumed the evidence? And why, despite decades of investigation, are we still no closer to the truth? Stick around, because tonight we're going deep into the case that haunted Austin, shattered four families, and exposed just how fragile justice can be. And as we dig into the details, I want you to tell me in the comments, based on the evidence, do you believe the real killers have already been caught, or are they still out there? And if you haven't already, hit subscribe now so you don't miss the next 5 parts of this investigation, because the deeper we go, the darker it gets. Now, let's start at the beginning. December 6th, 1991. Austin was in that brief, peaceful lull between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Downtown buzzing with Christmas lights, the air cool, but not yet bitter, the city alive with holiday shoppers. At the I can't believe it's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane, 17-year-old Eliza Thomas and 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison were working the closing shift. Jennifer's 15-year-old sister, Sarah, was hanging out in the store, waiting to ride home with her sister. And with them was 13-year-old Amy Ayers, the youngest, who had been out with Sarah earlier that evening and had decided to stick around. They were just normal teenagers in the safest of settings, wiping down counters, stacking chairs, the hum of the yogurt machines filling the quiet. Around 11 p.m., the front doors were locked as usual, but witnesses later said they saw people inside who didn't seem to be employees. 2 men, unknown to anyone at the shop, hanging around near the counter. By midnight, smoke was pouring from the building. Firefighters arrived expecting a small kitchen blaze, but what they found would leave even the most seasoned responders shaken. Inside, the air was thick and black, the smell of burning plastic mixed with something worse, something unmistakably human. As the flames were beaten back, the outlines of 4 bodies emerged on the floor, bound and gagged. Each girl had been shot in the head. The youngest, Amy, had been shot twice, once in the head, once in the body, as if someone had come back to make sure she was dead. There were signs some had been sexually assaulted, and around them, the fire had eaten away at what little physical evidence there was. Investigators realized quickly this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was cold, calculated, and designed to erase every trace of the killers. In the minutes after the fire was extinguished, the scene outside transformed. Police cars lined the block, crime scene tape snapped in the wind, and neighbors gathered in stunned silence, whispering as word spread. Parents clutched their kids a little tighter that night. The city didn't know it yet, but this case was about to become part of Austin's identity, a wound that would never fully close. And for the families of Eliza, Jennifer, Sarah, and Amy, this was the moment life divided into 2 parts, before December 6th and after. That night, detectives started their grim work, photographing the scene, collecting any fragments that might have survived the heat, interviewing witnesses about those 2 men seen in the store. But the clock was already ticking, and every hour that passed made the trail colder. The truth is, the fire had done its job. It had taken with it fingerprints, fibers, DNA, anything that might have pointed to the people responsible. What little remained would be fought over in courtrooms for decades. In those early hours, though, all anyone could do was ask the same question over and over. Who could do something like this to 4 innocent girls? And somewhere in the city that night, the person or people who did it were washing the smoke from their skin, tossing burned clothes, maybe even watching the news coverage. They knew something the rest of Austin didn't, that this case would never be simple, never be clean, and never be solved without a fight. This was only the beginning. By sunrise on December 7th, 1991, the yogurt shop was a crime scene swarming with detectives, firefighters, and forensic techs. The fire was officially ruled arson. Accelerants had been poured to ensure the blaze would destroy everything. But among the charred remains, investigators did find a few things worth noting. Melted bullet fragments, bindings that suggested the girls' hands had been tied, and faint traces of DNA. Not enough to identify anyone, but enough to know they weren't looking for just one person. Witness statements started trickling in. Some claimed they'd seen two suspicious men inside the store late that night, possibly Hispanic or white, with medium builds, one in a military-style jacket. Others described a small group of young men loitering in the parking lot earlier in the evening. But these were fleeting glimpses, vague, inconsistent, and nearly impossible to verify. Still, the Austin Police Department poured resources into following every lead. They canvassed nearby businesses, combed through local criminal records, and even brought in FBI profilers to build a psychological picture of the killers. The profile that emerged was chilling. Likely male, possibly in their late teens or early 20s, familiar with the area, and comfortable enough around violence to carry out an execution-style killing and then set a fire without panicking. Weeks passed with no arrests. Then, in early 1992, a tip came in that seemed promising, a local teenager bragging about being involved in the murders. Detectives brought him in, but the story crumbled under questioning. Still, the rumor had a ripple effect, bringing more names to the surface, each one leading to another dead end. For much of the decade, the case would go cold. Then, in 1999, a break, or what looked like one. A man named Maurice Pierce was stopped for carrying a gun in a mall parking lot. When police questioned him, he claimed he'd once lent that gun to a friend, a man named Michael Scott, who used it in the yogurt shop killings. That statement set off a chain reaction. Police arrested Scott, as well as two more men, Robert Springsteen Jr. and Forrest Wellborn. The theory was that the four had gone to the yogurt shop intending to rob it, but ended up killing the girls when things spiraled out of control. Under hours of interrogation, some of it aggressive and borderline coercive, Scott and Springsteen began to confess, though neither could agree on the exact details. Forrest Wellborn denied involvement entirely. The confessions were inconsistent, filled with contradictions, but to prosecutors, it was enough to move forward. Families of the victims were told the case was finally on its way to being solved. But inside those interview rooms, something was already going wrong. Investigators were asking leading questions, feeding details to the suspects, and recording statements that would later be torn apart in court. And there was one glaring problem. There was still no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness who could put these men inside the yogurt shop that night. But in the year 2000, with the confessions in hand, the state of Texas was ready to try its first defendant. What they didn't know was that they were about to step into one of the most controversial trials in Texas history, and that the case's foundations were already crumbling. In 2000, Robert Springsteen Jr. was the first to stand trial for the yogurt shop murders. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on his confession and the confession of Michael Scott. In their version, Springsteen was the ringleader, the one who ordered the girls to be bound, the one who pulled the trigger. But there was a glaring issue. The details in his confession didn't always match the physical evidence. Still, prosecutors argued that the inconsistencies were just the result of faded memories from a crime committed 9 years earlier. The jury bought it. Springsteen was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For the victims' families, it was a bittersweet victory, justice at last, but no real explanation for the unanswered questions. A year later, Michael Scott went to trial. His confession, too, was inconsistent, but the state presented it as corroboration of Springsteen's story. Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The message from prosecutors was clear. The case was closed. But defense attorneys weren't done fighting. They argued that both men's confessions had been coerced, extracted through hours of intimidation, leading questions, and psychological pressure. And then came the legal blow that would change everything. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Springsteen's conviction, ruling that his Sixth Amendment rights had been violated. The problem? At his trial, prosecutors had used Michael Scott's confession against him, even though Scott wasn't there to be cross-examined. The same issue was applied to Scott's case, and his conviction was overturned as well. By 2009, both men were back in court, but not as defendants in the same way. This time, they were fighting for their freedom. And then, something even more damaging to the prosecution emerged: DNA testing. For years, the technology hadn't been advanced enough to fully process the tiny biological traces found at the crime scene. But now, with improved testing, forensic analysts confirmed that the male DNA found inside the victims did not match Springsteen, did not match Scott, did not match Pierce, and did not match Wellborn. In other words, the only physical evidence in the case pointed to someone else entirely. Faced with that reality, the Travis County District Attorney's Office made a stunning decision. In June 2009, all charges against Springsteen and Scott were dismissed. The courtroom was silent as the announcement was read. The men walked free. For the families, it was like losing their daughters all over again. The killers were still out there. The case once again was wide open. Investigators promised they wouldn't stop, but after nearly 2 decades, the truth seemed further away than ever. And yet, there was still one fragile thread of hope: that DNA. The question was, would science ever catch up enough to tell them whose it was? In 2008, nearly 2 decades after the murders, the investigation gained fresh momentum. Not through a new witness, but through DNA. Investigators turned to a testing method called YSDR, which zeroes in on male-specific genetic material. Analysts used a vaginal swab taken from one of the victims, collected during the original 1991 autopsy, to isolate male DNA. It was the first glimpse of a potential chain of custody that had survived the flames. The YSDR profile identified one unknown male donor whose DNA could belong to the perpetrator, but that donor matched none of the 4 men who'd been arrested: Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, or Wellborn. The Travis County District Attorney at the time, Rosemary Lemberg, said she refused to retry them without knowing who that DNA belonged to. That breakthrough forced prosecutors to drop their plans for retrials and stack the case back into cold storage, just when it felt like there might be a way forward. But detectives refused to give up. In 2017, a renewed push for answers led investigators to search a public research DNA database. And, to their shock, they found what looked like a match to the unknown male's YSDR profile. It was a possible breakthrough on the horizon, until the anonymity of that database kicked in. The sample belonged to an anonymous donor provided through the FBI, and federal privacy law barred the Bureau from identifying the person. Austin officials were stuck with a tantalizing lead, and no name in 2020, the FBI agreed to retest the sample at prosecutors' urging. The original profile had only 16 markers, minimal for reliable identification, but new testing expanded it to 25 markers. The hope? Conclusive confirmation. When the result came back, relief turned to heartbreak. The updated profile explicitly excluded the anonymous donor. The lead vanished. Still, Detective Dan Jackson, who took charge of the case in 2022, hasn't abandoned the DNA trail. He remains confident that forensic science, even more advanced than today, can eventually pinpoint the suspect. His persistence is part of what the HBO docu-series brings to life. Not just old errors and grief, but undimmed hope rooted in evolving science. As the camera zooms in on labs, dusty files, and past crime scenes, you're left with a chilling realization. The case's moment of greatest promise also became its cruelest disappointment. There's a fragment of truth out there, frozen in DNA, waiting for the right method, the right breakthrough, to bring justice to 4 girls whose story doesn't deserve to be forgotten. And tomorrow, we'll go deeper into the heart of the city, its memories, its trauma, and how a community refuses to let them fade away. By the mid-2010s, the yogurt shop murders had become a grim part of Austin's collective memory. The kind of case you can mention with just 3 words and everyone knows what you mean. But to detectives still assigned to it, the case file wasn't just history. It was an open wound. Over the years, several other names had surfaced as potential suspects. Some were dismissed quickly. Others lingered in the investigation for months before quietly disappearing from the radar. One of the more chilling theories was that the murders weren't a botched robbery at all, but something far darker. Some investigators believed the girls were targeted by someone they knew, possibly connected to other violent crimes in Texas at the time. Others leaned toward the theory of a transient or drifter, someone who could vanish from the city without leaving a trace. Then there was the DNA, that tiny genetic fingerprint belonging to an unknown male. Detectives ran it through CODIS, the FBI's national database, countless times. No match. Every so often, they'd get a hit, but each one turned out to be a false lead. A partial profile, a contaminated sample, or a relative match that fizzled out under closer analysis. Still, they kept testing, hoping that one day the right name would light up their screen. Meanwhile, the public never stopped speculating. True crime forums, podcasts, and even amateur sleuths on social media dissected every known detail of the case. Some focused on the original 4 suspects, wondering if their dismissals had been premature. Others pointed fingers at entirely new people, citing rumors, secondhand stories, or mysterious behaviors. The truth was, the investigation's sheer complexity made it impossible to settle on a single suspect without hard evidence. And hard evidence was the one thing this case refused to give up. For the families, the passing years brought a cruel paradox. The world kept moving forward, but their daughters remained frozen in 1991, forever teenagers in their memories. They attended every public update, pressed police for answers, and spoke at vigils that grew smaller with time. The city of Austin changed. The yogurt shop building was torn down, but the case file, thick, worn, and stained from years of handling, still sat on the shelf in the cold case unit. And inside it, buried among the thousands of pages, were 2 simple questions that still haunted everyone who had ever worked the case. Who killed Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, and Amy, and why? By the 30th anniversary in December 2021, the case had officially outlived some of the original investigators who first walked into that yogurt shop in the early hours of December 7th, 1991. But those still alive, and the new detectives who inherited the file, were more determined than ever. The families of Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, and Amy Ayers gathered once again, this time in front of a new generation of cameras, microphones, and reporters. The city's skyline had changed. Many of the businesses from that era were long gone, but the grief in the families' voices hadn't aged a day. Investigators revealed they were still working leads, still running the unknown male's DNA through databases, and still interviewing potential witnesses, some of whom had been too scared to come forward in the 90s. Technology had evolved. Techniques like genealogical DNA mapping, which had cracked decades-old cold cases across the country, were now part of the plan. Detectives hoped that one distant relative of the killer might unknowingly upload their DNA to a genealogy site and finally give them a path to his name. Yet, even with science on their side, the case remained stubborn. There were whispers of new persons of interest, but nothing public. Every so often, a media outlet would drop a headline suggesting major developments, but the inside reality was quieter, more methodical, and more frustrating. Still, the families held on. They became advocates for cold case funding, pushing lawmakers to keep resources flowing into old investigations. They met with other families of unsolved murder victims, offering the same kind of support they wished they had received in those early days. And through it all, the 4 girls, their smiles, their laughter, their futures, remained at the center of every conversation. In Austin, the yogurt shop murders became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. They were a reminder that even when a case grows cold, the people who love the victims can keep the heat alive. And somewhere, in the quiet spaces where memories and secrets live, the truth is still waiting to be found. Maybe it's locked in someone's conscience. Maybe it's sitting in an old box in a forgotten storage unit. Or maybe it's hidden in plain sight, in the face of someone who's been walking free all these years. The city hasn't given up. The families haven't given up. And neither should we. Because justice delayed is not justice denied. As long as we keep asking the question, who killed Jennifer, Eliza, Sarah, and Amy, and why? If this case moved you, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the killer was someone the girls knew? Or a stranger who slipped away forever? Leave your theories in the comments. And if you believe these 4 deserve justice, make sure you're subscribed, because the moment there's a breakthrough, we'll cover it here. Your view, your voice, might help keep this story alive until the very end.